imagine the moment when heaven itself intervenes in human history. Welcome back to God's story, Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In our last episode, we unveiled the ancient prophecies of a promised Savior. Today, the silence of the skies shatters as the angel Gabriel brings a message that will change everything. How will Mary embrace this divine calling? And what part will Joseph play in the unfolding of God's miraculous plan? Let's step into this extraordinary chapter together.
Whoa. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a fleeting shield against the night's chill. The old shepherd's voice broke the stillness, rough and low. "It's been so long," he said, staring into the flames. "So many years of silence. But silence isn't the end. It's the waiting." The younger shepherds leaned closer, their breaths held. Isaiah spoke of light. Micah of a child, the old man continued. But now, we've only the stars to remind us. One boy whispered, do you think it's true? The shepherd's eyes glimmered. The promise lives, and when it breaks the silence, nothing will be the same. The old shepherd leaned into the firelight, his face a study in shadow and flame. "The prophets promised us light," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. "But promises are hard to hold in silence." He looked skyward, the stars glittering coldly. Isaiah, Micah, they saw what we cannot, and yet we wait. A younger shepherd broke the quiet. "But what if it never comes?" The old man's lips curved in a faint smile. "It will come," he said firmly. "The silence isn't forever. It's only the breath before the shout. And when it comes, we'll know." The village of Nazareth lay nestled in the folds of the Galilean hills, its simple homes scattered like stones tossed by a careful hand. The sun was just beginning to rise, its soft light spilling over the fields and rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched lazily across the ground. The air carried the faint scent of olive trees and freshly tilled earth, mingling with the distant hum of morning activity as the village slowly stirred to life. Inside one of the modest homes, Mary moved about with quiet purpose. Her bare feet padded softly against the worn dirt floor as she carried a clay jar of water, its weight balanced effortlessly on her hip. The room was small but orderly, its walls adorned with simple woven mats, and the faint fragrance of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. There was hands, delicate yet calloused from work, moved with practiced ease as she tended to the tasks of the day. She lit the small clay lamp on the table, its flickering light casting a warm glow that seemed to soften the humble surroundings. There was a rhythm to her movements, a calm and steady grace that spoke of a life rooted in simplicity and devotion. As she worked, Mary hummed a quiet tune, a melody passed down through generations, its notes carrying the weight of tradition and faith. Her voice, soft and clear, filled the room with a sense of peace, as though the very walls leaned in to listen. When the chores were done, she set the jar of water down by the door and reached for her shawl, draping it loosely over her head. She knelt by the small wooden bench near the window, her hands clasped together, her gaze fixed on the faint light of the morning sky. Her lips moved silently in prayer, her words known only to the heavens. There was a stillness to her posture, a quiet strength that belied her young age. Though she was but a simple girl in a quiet village, her heart carried the weight of a faith that transcended time and circumstance. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I am yours. Use me as you will." And the words hung in the air, a tender offering that seemed to linger even after they had been spoken. Mary's expression remained serene, her eyes closing briefly as if to seal her prayer. In that moment she appeared almost timeless, a figure suspended between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The sound of a distant voice calling her name broke the stillness, drawing her back to the present. Mary rose gracefully, adjusting her shawl before stepping outside. The sunlight met her face, and for a moment she paused, her gaze sweeping over the familiar sights of her village. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something unseen, yet significant, was stirring just beyond the horizon. As she made her way down the narrow path, her steps light and unhurried, the world around her seemed to hum with quiet expectation. The birds in the olive trees sang a song that felt almost sacred, their notes mingling with the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Mary did not yet know what the day would bring, but there was a calm assurance in her heart, a sense that she was exactly where she needed to be. And so, as Nazareth awakened around her, Mary moved forward, her life a quiet testament to faith, humility, and readiness for the unknown. The air inside the small home seemed to shift, a stillness descending that was both calming and electric. Mary had just finished her morning prayer, her hands still clasped, her head bowed in quiet reflection. The faint hum of the village outside faded, replaced by a silence that felt alive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. A light, soft at first, but growing steadily, filled the room. It was not the warm glow of the lamp or the sunlight streaming through the window, but a radiance unlike anything Mary had ever seen. It was pure, otherworldly, and it seemed to emanate from every corner of the space at once. Mary's breath caught in her chest as she looked up, her eyes widening. Before she stood a figure, tall and resplendent, cloaked in light so brilliant it was almost difficult to look at directly. Yet there was a gentleness in his presence, a quiet strength that eased the edge of her fear. "Greetings, Mary," the figure said, his voice deep and resonant, yet soft enough to soothe her trembling heart. "You are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary's hands fell to her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, unsure if what she was seeing was real. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into her consciousness. She could feel her pulse quicken, her thoughts racing as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Do not be afraid, Mary," the figure continued, his tone steady and kind, as though he could see the questions forming in her mind, "for you have found favor with God." The room seemed to grow brighter as he spoke, the light enveloping Mary like a warm embrace. She swallowed hard, her voice small and hesitant. What do you mean?" The figure smiled, a gesture that seemed to carry both reassurance and gravity. "You will conceive and give birth to a son," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." Mary's breath caught again, the enormity of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. She stared at him, her mind reeling. "How can this be?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am a virgin." The figure's expression did not waver. "The Holy Spirit will come upon you," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty, "and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." Mary's hands tightened around the fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the magnitude of what she was being asked to carry. Yet, within that weight, there was also a strange and unexplainable peace. The figure's light seemed to pulse, a soft rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. "Even Elizabeth, your relative," he added, his tone lighter now, "is going to have a child in her old age, and she, who was said to be unable to conceive, is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." Mary's breath steadied as she met the figure's gaze. The fear that had gripped her moments ago began to loosen its hold, replaced by a quiet resolve. She straightened slightly, her voice soft but firm. "I am the Lord's servant," she said. "May your word to me be fulfilled." The figure smiled again, a warmth radiating from him that filled the room. Slowly, the light began to fade, the figure dissolving into the brightness until only Mary remained, sitting alone in the quiet. The room was as it had been before, yet everything had changed. Her heart swelled with a mixture of awe, humility, and faith. Her hands clasped once more as she whispered a prayer of thanks. And in the stillness, the promise of what was to come burned brightly within her. Oh, the room was still, the faint glow of the morning sun casting soft light across the humble walls. Mary knelt on the worn mat in the corner, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her breath came slowly, deliberately, as though each inhale carried with it the weight of what she had just heard. The angel's words echoed in her mind, clear and unyielding, a message so profound it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "I am the Lord's servant," she had said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. But now, as the light of the angel's presence faded and she was left alone, the enormity of her acceptance settled over her like a heavy but comforting blanket. Her thoughts raced, darting between awe and uncertainty. She thought of the child she was to bear, the Son of the Most High, and what this would mean for her, for Joseph, and for the world. Her chest tightened slightly as questions bubbled up, questions that she knew she could not yet answer. Still, her heart remained calm, a strange peace settling in the midst of the unknown. Mary raised her head slowly, her eyes scanning the room, as if searching for some visible trace of the divine encounter that had just taken place. Everything appeared as it had been, simple, unassuming. Yet, within her, everything was different. The air felt charged, alive, as though the very walls bore witness to the extraordinary promise she had received. She rose to her feet, smoothing the fabric of her dress with trembling hands. Her steps were careful as she moved to the small table by the window, her fingers brushing lightly against the wooden surface. Outside, the village of Nazareth was beginning to stir, the sounds of daily life seeping through the stillness of the morning. It was a reminder of the ordinary world she inhabited, even as her role in God's extraordinary plan began to unfold. Mary stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The hills stretched out before her, bathed in golden light, their beauty quiet and steadfast. She thought of the generations that had come before her, the countless prayers offered in hope and faith. And now she was part of that story, a thread in the great tapestry of God's promise. Her lips moved in silent prayer, her words offered not in fear but in trust. "Lord, guide me," she whispered. "I do not know what lies ahead, but I trust in your plan." The sound of footsteps outside the door brought her back to the present. She turned, her hands folding neatly in front of her as she waited. It was Joseph, she realized, his familiar voice calling her name softly. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, her heart lifting slightly at the thought of him. She did not yet know how he would respond to what she must tell him, but she held on to the angel's assurance. "Do not be afraid." As she moved toward the door, her steps grew firmer, her resolve stronger. She was no longer just Mary of Nazareth. She was Mary, chosen by God to carry His promise into the world. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she walked forward in faith, her spirit alight with humility and strength that could only come from above. The light in the room dimmed slowly, fading into the soft golden hue of the morning sun filtering through the window. The presence of the angel, once so radiant and overwhelming, now left behind the stillness that felt both peaceful and profound. Mary stood in the center of the room, her hands resting gently on her abdomen, as if already cradling the promise that had been spoken to her. For a moment she remained motionless, her eyes tracing the space where the angel had stood. Though the figure was gone, the memory of his words lingered, echoing in her mind like a melody she could not forget. Her heart swelled with an indescribable mixture of emotions: wonder, humility, and the faintest thread of fear. She moved slowly to the small wooden bench near the window and sank onto it, her hands still clasped tightly together. Her gaze shifted to the sky, now painted with the soft blues and pinks of dawn. The world outside seemed untouched by the extraordinary encounter she had just experienced, as if it had no knowledge of the divine message that had been delivered within these humble walls. Mary breathed deeply, her shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The quiet of the room was broken only by the soft rustle of the breeze through the olive trees outside. She closed her eyes, replaying the angel's final words, "For no word from God will ever fail." Those words, simple yet profound, wrapped around her heart like a shield. They anchored her amidst the vastness of what she had just agreed to. The angel had departed, but the weight of the promise he carried remained, pressing gently but firmly on her spirit. And peeled her eyes, her hands unclasping to rest on her lap. The room, now bathed in soft morning light, felt different somehow. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the encounter, holding on to the faint trace of the holy. Mary knew she was no longer the same. She had been chosen, set apart, and though she could not see the road ahead, she felt a deep and abiding trust that God's hand would guide her. Her thoughts turned to Joseph. She would have to tell him, though she could scarcely imagine how. Would he believe her? Would he share in the awe and gravity of what she had been told? Her heart ached slightly at the thought of his potential doubt, but she steeled herself with the angel's reassurance. "Do not be afraid." Rising from the bench, Mary adjusted her shawl and moved to the door. Her steps were careful, her body still carrying the weight of the divine encounter. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air brushed against her face, refreshing and grounding her. The village was beginning to awaken, the sounds of daily life stirring gently around her. Mary stood for a moment at the threshold, her eyes lifting once more to the sky. The angel was gone, the light of his presence now replaced by the light of the rising sun. But in her heart, the promise remained, steady, unwavering, eternal. With a final breath, she stepped forward, her spirit alight with quiet determination. The journey had begun, and though the path was unknown, Mary walked it with faith, her heart carrying the weight and wonder of God's plan. The workshop was dimly lit, the faint light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the rough wooden walls. Joseph sat on a low stool, his hands resting on a plank of unfinished wood, though his mind was far from his work. The tools of his trade lay scattered on the table before him, untouched for hours. His normally steady hands, accustomed to shaping wood with precision, now trembled slightly as he ran his fingers along the grain of the timber, searching for answers he could not find. The news had come suddenly, shattering the quiet rhythm of his life. Mary, his betrothed, was with child. The words echoed in his mind, their weight pressing heavily on his chest. He could still see her face as she told him, her eyes wide and earnest, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling around them both. She had spoken of an angel, of a message from God, of a promise so great it defied comprehension. Joseph rose from the stool, pacing the small workshop as his thoughts tumbled over one another. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet, a soft rhythmic sound that did little to calm his racing mind. His heart ached with confusion and doubt. He wanted to believe her, to trust the purity of her words and the sincerity in her eyes. But how could he? How could he reconcile her story with the reality before him? He paused by the window, leaning heavily on the frame as he gazed out at the quiet streets of Nazareth. The village, bathed in the warm hues of twilight, seemed unaware of the turmoil that churned within him. The scent of olive trees mingled with the faint smoke from evening fires, a reminder of the ordinary life that continued around him, even as his own world felt as though it were falling apart. Joseph's jaw tightened as he considered his options. He could not marry her, not now, not with this shadow hanging over them, but neither could he bear the thought of exposing her to public shame. Mary was kind, gentle, and faithful. He could not condemn her, even if he struggled to understand her story. His heart clenched at the thought of her facing the scorn of the village, her reputation torn apart by whispers and accusations. A soft sigh escaped his lips as he turned away from the window, his hand running through his dark, disheveled hair. He sank back onto the stool, his head bowing as he rested his elbows on his knees. There had to be another way, he thought. Perhaps he could end their engagement quietly, slip away without drawing attention, allowing her to go on with her life in peace. The idea brought him little comfort. It was a solution, but not one that settled the unease gnawing at his soul. He closed his eyes, his hands clasping together in a gesture of prayer. "Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking, "what am I to do? Show me the way. Help me to understand." The room fell silent, save for the soft creak of the wood and the faint rustle of the wind outside. Joseph remained still, his heart heavy, his thoughts a tangle of doubt and duty, love and confusion. The night stretched on, and though the answers did not come, his prayer lingered in the air, a plea for clarity, for guidance, for peace. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Joseph remained where he was, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. He did not yet know what he would do, but he held on to the faint hope that the God he had always trusted would not abandon him now in his hour of deepest need. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, wrapping the world in a heavy silence. Joseph lay on his cot, his body tense despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. The workshop, now shrouded in darkness, carried the faint scent of sawdust and olive oil, remnants of the day's labor. His eyes, heavy with the strain of unanswered questions, fluttered shut as sleep finally claimed him. In the darkness of his dream, a light began to grow, soft and warm at first, but quickly expanding until it enveloped everything. Joseph found himself standing in the midst of it, the radiance so pure and intense that it felt as though it had weight, pressing gently against him. He raised a hand instinctively to shield his eyes, but the light did not burn. Instead, it filled him with a strange and unexplainable peace. "Joseph, son of David," a voice called, clear and resonant, cutting through the light like a steady breeze. It was a voice unlike any he had ever heard. Strong, yet gentle, commanding, yet comforting. Joseph lowered his hand, his heart pounding in his chest as he turned toward the source of the voice. Before him stood a figure clothed in brilliance, the very essence of light itself. Though the figure's features were indistinct, its presence radiated power and kindness, a combination that eased Joseph's fear, even as it filled him with awe. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife," a figure said, its tone steady and reassuring, "for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit." Joseph's breath caught in his chest as the words settled over him, their meaning sinking deep into his heart. He thought of Mary's face, the sincerity in her eyes as she had spoken of the angel's message, and suddenly everything seemed to fall into place. The figure continued, its voice unwavering. "She will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." The light around the figure pulsed gently, as though the very air was responding to the power of its words. Joseph felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet conviction replacing the doubts and fears that had weighed so heavily on him just hours before. "Jesus," Joseph whispered, the name tasting unfamiliar yet sacred on his tongue. He bowed his head, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. "I will obey," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I will do as the Lord commands." The figure's light grew brighter for a moment, a final affirmation of the divine message, before slowly beginning to fade. The warmth lingered even as the light diminished, and Joseph felt a sense of clarity and peace, unlike anything he had ever known. When he awoke, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft glow through the small window of his workshop. Joseph sat up slowly, his heart still beating with the steady rhythm of the dream. The air around him felt different, charged with a quiet purpose. He rose from the cot, his movements deliberate as he dressed and prepared for the day. His doubts had not disappeared entirely, but they no longer held him captive. The words of the angel rang clear in his mind, anchoring him as he stepped forward into the unknown. Joseph's gaze shifted to the tools on his workbench, symbols of his trade and his life. He placed his hand on the worn surface, his grip firm, his resolve stronger than it had been in days. He would go to Mary, he decided. He would stand by her, protect her, and trust in the plan that had been laid before them. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the room, Joseph felt a quiet determination settle over him. He was not alone in this. The light of the dream, the voice of the angel, and the promise of the child to come, they would guide him through whatever lay ahead. The fire had burned low, its once bright flames reduced to glowing embers that pulsed softly in the cool night air. The old shepherd sat close, his weathered face illuminated by the faint orange light, his hands resting heavily on his staff. Around him, the younger shepherds waited in silence, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. The stars above shone brilliantly, their steady light a quiet reminder of the vastness of the heavens. The old man cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness like the first note of a song. "Do you understand what we've just spoken of?" he asked, his tone low but resonant, his words carrying the weight of years. He looked from one face to another, his eyes searching for understanding in the flickering light. The youngest of the group, a boy no older than 12, hesitated before speaking. It's about faith," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "and trust." The old shepherd smiled faintly, and the lines on his face deepening. "Yes," he said, nodding slowly, "faith and trust, but also something more." He paused, his gaze drifting upward to the stars. "It's about obedience, about listening to the voice of God, even when you don't understand what He's asking of you." The group shifted slightly, the weight of his words settling over them. One of the older shepherds, his beard streaked with grey, leaned forward. "But how do we know?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "How do we know that what we hear is truly from God?" The old man's eyes returned to the fire, his hands tightening briefly on his staff. "You'll know," he said simply, "not with your ears, but with your heart. When God speaks, it's not the words that matter most, it's the truth that you feel deep within, the kind that doesn't let go." He leaned back slightly, his gaze once again turning to the heavens. "Mary and Joseph didn't understand everything they were asked to do," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Mary was just a young girl, humble and unassuming, yet she said, 'I am the Lord's servant.' And Joseph, he struggled, as any man would, but when the angel came to him, he obeyed. Not because it was easy, but because it was right." The fire crackled softly, the sound a gentle punctuation to his words. The shepherds sat quietly, their faces thoughtful as they absorbed the story. The old man looked at them again, his expression gentle but resolute. "Obedience isn't about having all the answers," he said. "It's about trust. Trust that God's plan is bigger than anything we can see. Trust that even when we don't understand, He is working for something good." The youngest boy looked up, his eyes wide and bright. "Do you think we'll see it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Messiah?" The old shepherd's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Perhaps," he said, his tone filled with quiet wonder. "Perhaps not, but that doesn't change the truth of it. Whether we see it or not, the promise remains, and our part is to believe, to trust, and to prepare the way." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as though sharing a secret with the night itself. "The Messiah is coming," he said, "and when he does, it will be like the stars breaking through the darkest of nights, a light that cannot be extinguished." The shepherds nodded slowly, their hearts stirred by his words. Above them the stars continued their silent vigil, their light unwavering against the darkness. The fire, though small, burned steadily, its warmth a quiet testament to the light they awaited. The old shepherd sat back, his body weary but his spirit strong. "Go," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of one who has lived long and seen much. "Rest now, and hold on to the promise, for it is closer than we think."
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. If you enjoyed it, please like and share this video to spread the message of hope and faith. In the next episode, we'll follow Mary and Joseph as they embark on a difficult journey to Bethlehem, where miracles await. Don't forget to subscribe to God's Story and turn on notifications to stay with us on this journey. See you next time.